We are delighted to bring panelists to the stage with a new addition as well to the panel. We're going to start with Kathy Jacobs. Kathy is the professor and director for the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions at University of Arizona. Dr. Suzanne Moser, geographer. Dr. Lynn Carter of Louisiana State University. A new addition, T.C. Richmond, partner with Van Ness Feldman. And we're going to moderate this panel with Jim Beiser. He's professor and director of climate adaptation and international development at University of Arizona. So welcome to session 10.
Thank you. And as we get settled, I just wanted to point out, Duke told me yesterday, look, in Phoenix, we tuck our shirt in. So, but then I talked to Dave White, and he didn't have his shirt tucked in. And then I went out and looked, and he had his shirt tucked in. So I'm going to, well, anyway, here we are in Phoenix. I think Dave does it for stylish reasons. I do it because I need to cover my gut a little bit. So anyhow, we're going to have fun, but we're going to have fun around a really serious topic and a really serious effort. Thanks, Lynn. Yes, my name is Jim Beiser. I'm a professor of climate adaptation and international development at the University of Arizona. We're going to, what we're going to do today is we're going to have a bit of a conversation. We're going to have a little bit from up here after we describe what the National Climate Assessment is. We promise that NCA, National Climate Assessment, is the only acronym we'll use throughout the presentation. But first, before I came to the U of A, I was here at ASU. In fact, my position wasn't too terribly different from Duke's, although I think, well, I admire him greatly for still being here. You all heard Michael Crow last night, and they say something about sort of flying too close to the flame for too long. So shortly after I got here to ASU, my job was to conceptualize, design, and create what sustainability was going to be at ASU. And today we have a Global Institute of Sustainability and a School of Sustainability. But one of the very first things I wanted to do was, because water is important for sustainability, I thought, why don't we convene the sort of 100 most important people in Arizona around water, Ray Quay and some others, and call it a water conversation. And people said, well, you know, that's a really good idea, but don't call it a water conversation because it sounds too much like water conservation and no one will show up. So we had our water dialogue, and we filled the room. And that was sort of the beginning of my introduction to what's really important around sustainability here in Arizona. And that was 16 years ago, and here we are, Duke's convening a summit. It's not just about water, it's not just Arizona, it's across the United States. So we've really made some progress. So in September, Duke approached me about the National Climate Assessment, including a panel on the National Climate Assessment in this 10X, 10 across, and said, can you go out and reach out and get like the best folks to talk about the National Climate Assessment? Sure, you know, I'm happy to do that. And so I thought about it, and I thought about who would be the best people for this exact forum, and came up with these folks. Well, I looked really hard, because I'm worried about this whole gender diversity thing. So I worked really hard to find a guy. I thought about David, but he's got his own panel. And then, as you heard earlier, TC has joined us, and she's not in your booklet. We've asked her to describe a little bit more what she does in a minute. But when we learned that Senator Landrieu couldn't be here, and then TC works as her colleague, that's why TC is here. And so to round out this dream team, we asked TC to join us. Thank you, TC. Okay. We intend to leave well, we started 10 minutes late, so we'll see what we can do, but we intend to leave 20 to 30 minutes at the end so that we can really engage you. This is really important, to be able to engage you as much as possible. The people here, every one of them have been involved in multiple national climate assessments. After I describe and go through a little bit of history about what that is, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper with a few questions, and then we're going to bring you in to ask them some really hard questions. Grady, hard questions. Okay. In 1990, Congress passed the Global Change Research Act. I was at NOAA at the time. I worked in the office that drafted a lot of that legislation. When it finally came out, there were a lot of familiar words there. That Global Change Research Act pulled together 13 agencies plus the Office of the President to organize the science around global climate change. So that was 1990, and if you do your math, that was under President Bush. Just to say. And I'm going to read what the Act says: to provide for development and coordination of a comprehensive and integrated United States research program which will assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. Not less frequently than every 4 years, shall prepare and submit to the President and Congress an assessment. And I'll tell you in a minute what it does, but first, some more math. 4 years since 1990, we're in, like, say, 2020 almost, so we probably should have, 8 or 9 of these. We have 4 of them. We had one in 2000, one in 2009. We'll hear a lot about the one in 2014 that Kathy led, and then in 2018. And it's to integrate, evaluate, and interpret the findings of the program and discuss the scientific uncertainties associated with such findings. It analyzes the effects of global change on the natural environment, agriculture, energy, production and use, land and water uses, transportation, human health and welfare, human social systems, and biological diversity. It analyzes the current trends in global change, both human-induced and natural projects, out into the future. So it's the most comprehensive scientific report on climate change and its impacts in the United States. If you all if you haven't seen it, don't know about it, you will a little bit after today, but I certainly would encourage you to go online and check it out. It's the gold standard for guiding leaders and decision makers, in particular, in assessing risk and considering solutions. So the fourth National Climate Assessment, which was released in November 2018, Black Friday, day after Thanksgiving. Some more math. In 2 volumes, and actually the first volume was released in 2017. The first volume focused on the science, the physical science of it, and the second volume was much more focused on impacts, adaptation, and really what we're going to do about it. That was the second volume. So in that second volume, which is mostly what we'll be talking about, of this fourth National Climate Assessment, there were 15 sectoral and cross-sectoral chapters, 10 regional chapters. There was a new international chapter, and I don't remember how many pages, but the last 2 have been somewhere around 1,000 pages. If you were to print it out, they're online. You can print them out, but I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about one of the beauties of using the web for this kind of activity. The main findings were, and no surprising, but they were really firm words. The global climate is changing faster than ever, that the changes are primarily due to human activity, that the impacts are being felt across the country already in the resources that we manage, in the well-being of people, in our economies, that Americans are responding, but that the efforts to mitigate and to adapt are not at the scale needed to avoid substantial damage. So those are the primary findings. Okay, so we're going to move into our panel here very quickly, but just to underscore, an assessment is not a literature review, right, of all that's out there. It is a synthesis of what has been found, to arrive at an assessment of what we know based on the research and the experience of experts. So it's a synthesis of what's out there in the published literature through experience, brought together by experts that have been selected, and then it is really, again, what do we know? How do we know it? How confident are we about what we know, and what will we do with this information? Okay, so assuming that you've read the bios in the little pamphlets, we're going to go ahead and let each one of these ladies just perhaps add a little bit that's not in the bio, particularly what are they doing now, maybe specific to this conference, what they've heard in this conference, perhaps, and then just a primary main point. And what we'll do is we'll start, and then we'll ask TC maybe to say a little extra, since she's not in the book. And we'll start with Kathy, and then we'll come back around and ask some questions.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, everybody. We're really excited to talk to you about the National Climate Assessment, and you're probably wondering why it is that we're so excited about talking to you about a climate report. But by the end of this session, we hope that you too will be inspired by the vision that we've been developing, sort of moving forward from where we've been in the past. My background is as a water manager for the state of Arizona. I worked 23 years for the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and I was very pleased and proud to be part of many of the programs you heard Catherine Sorensen talking about yesterday. So I helped to develop all the mandatory conservation requirements for the groundwater users in the state, the Assured Water Supply Program, the recharge and recovery rules. It was an amazing place to be. But something strange happened to me in the late 1990s, and I sort of got sucked into the whole climate arena and started working through really a fluke on the first National Climate Assessment, and found myself writing the chapter on water for the entire country for that assessment. And I have never recovered. I am a real enthusiast of this whole process, and I hope you'll understand why before we're done here. But I think the process of really understanding what science is and how the process works and how people's understanding over time really evolves is a critical process. And I am now at the University of Arizona as a faculty member. Jim and I actually teach a course on how to do climate assessments. It has become a really significant part of my life, but the main reason that I think they're important is the focus on adaptation. How are we going to take this information and move it into a place where we can actually use it and manage risk? And so I run a center called the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions. The acronym is CCAS. Some people think the acronym is actually kick-ass, which works for me. But anyway, we're really interested in significantly mobilizing change, and that's sort of what I'm all about. I'm not a big rule follower person, as many people in this room already know. Anyway, I think that's enough about me.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Susie Moser, and I love my little affiliation. I'm a geographer. I'm a student of the Earth. I do have other affiliations, too. I'll just spare you the list. But what I've done for the last 25 years is work on adaptation, particularly in coastal areas, which led me in the third assessment that Kathy led to be what we call the convening lead author of the coastal chapter. So that means I herded cats for 2 years or so of getting a number of different experts and practitioners to actually tell us what they think is most important, what do we know about it, what do we not know about that. In addition to that, I co-led with another colleague from George Mason University the engagement and communication working group of that assessment, and served on the executive committee for the whole enterprise. So had a little bit experience watching over Kathy's shoulders as she led us through that process. And otherwise, I basically do independent research and consult with local communities, state agencies, federal agencies, foundations, NGOs on any questions related to adaptation. So I'll stop with that and turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Lynn Carter. I've been involved in climate change issues since 1988, my first workshop at the University of Rhode Island. Excuse me. I've been an author, a lead author, an advisory committee member, or staff for all 4 of the U.S. National Climate Assessments. For the most recent assessment and the previous one, I was the lead for the Southeast because I was at LSU at the time. In my short bio, I mentioned that I was the Associate Director for SCIP, the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. It's a NOAA-RISA program at LSU, but I was also the Associate Director for the Coastal Sustainability Studio. It was a multidisciplinary effort to bring various perspectives to the issues of living on a changing coastline. It's probably not dissimilar, but a whole lot smaller than what's going on here. At ASU. Now, I am adjunct faculty at this moment at LSU, and I'm also delighted to say I'm beginning an affiliation here with the Center for Emergency Management and Homeland Security. But I want to make another comment, since this is my first chance to say something about the National Climate Assessment, what I think is important. First, of course, I'm delighted to be here. For the first U.S. National Climate Assessment, we didn't know what the communities or what the regions, I was the liaison to all the regions, we didn't know what the regions were going to choose for issues. They chose the issues by what was important and by the authors that they had. They worked together. The only issue, there was only one issue that, and at that time there were 20 regions, there was only one issue that all 20 regions looked at, and it was water, which was a big surprise to all of us. We didn't know what to expect. They could choose the issues that they wanted. From all different perspectives, mind you, because water is quite a different issue in different places, but water was the only issue everyone looked at. And I just want to say that because the issues were chosen in the regions by the authors and by the public, it's really, really important for the public to be involved. This is my first message about the assessment. Be involved, because we as authors, yes, we might know some of the issues, we know some of the science may be better, but what do you care about? What matters to you? If you tell the authors, then that becomes the focus, and that becomes what we can address that would really help all of you. So that's my first message about the assessment.
TC Richmond. It's Therese, but I'm called TC. I have the honor of working with Senator Landrieu. She's primarily in our DC office, and I work primarily. I live in Seattle and work primarily out of our Seattle Venice Feldman office. And I communicated with her yesterday to let her know I was on the panel, and she expressed her regret that she couldn't be here, and I think that you'll see her at future conferences here. In Seattle, I intersect with these folks because of my time here in Arizona, but I started off working in the state of Washington, and it's the issues that I deal with are really, it's sort of connecting issues and connecting people, and it's always been that way, probably partly because of my personality of connecting folks, but it's in the water arena. I inched into the water arena via Superfund contamination cases, and then working with, this is all through the Attorney General's office of the state of Washington, working on fish habitat issues and tribal settlements, and then working for the governor's office doing the same. I came down here in the 90s and was Kathy's deputy for a little while, did a little bit of work on one of those conservation plans, and then became chief legal counsel for ADWR under Betsy Reekie and Rita McGuire, and worked on lots of interesting things, including with California, and then some of the Indian settlements. Because of my experience in Washington State, I was able to work on those issues. So then I went back up to Arizona. This is, following a spouse who's getting a PhD. So we went back up to Seattle, and I worked again at the Attorney General's office for 10 years at the University of Washington, which gave me the ability to work with scientists and people who are really concerned about the integrity of science, so that when Kathy asked me to join the Federal Advisory Committee working on the National Climate Assessment 3, I was able to do that. I then went into private practice. It was easier for me to do that. And I ended up being the vice chair of the Federal Advisory Committee. I'm a very process-oriented person, and I think that the things that I tried to work on are bringing the National Climate Assessment, bringing value to decision makers, making sure that it was useful for those of us who go back on the front and do land use, growth management, and water rights, and how it's going to help us and our clients. So that's what I tried to do in the third National Climate Assessment, and we'll get into more discussion on moving forward. I've tried to continue to be as supportive as I can in a sustained assessment process.
Great, thank you. So, Kathy, why is the National Climate Assessment such a big deal? In other words, a bunch of, say, 300-400 authors get together, all volunteer, by the way, a bunch of review. Beyond just doing what the law says, why is it a big deal?
Well, I think everyone who has been reading the news in the last several decades understands there's a lot of debate about climate issues, and it's partly because they've become really politicized. And I think the main reason now that the National Climate Assessment is important is helping people actually navigate through all of that messy stuff to what is actually believed to be the core. What do we know? And what don't we know? And what are the uncertainties, and why are they uncertain? There are thousands and thousands of papers published every year, and lots of people like to point to the fact that the models actually report a range of different futures. Well, they report a range of different futures for specific reasons. The models were created differently, they use different data, they focus on different scales, etc. And once you have people who can help understand that, a lot of the smoke clears, and you can actually see what we know and how to use what we know. So I think beyond the fact that it is reviewed more than any report I've ever heard of, it's actually an astonishing amount of review that goes into these reports. All of the authors review it, all of the federal agencies that are engaged review it. The National Academies has a special committee that reviews it, generally more than once. The White House always engages and reviews it as well. But the changes that are made to those reports have to be agreed to by the authors. So it actually has a huge amount of transparency, and it is absolutely credible. Are there mistakes in it? Certainly it's possible that there could be, but there's so much review that the things that are controversial really do get worked out.
Right, and so we're going to be, thank you, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the NCA 4, not a lot, because we'd like to talk about, and this is maybe a surprise at Duke because we pitched it a little bit differently, what going forward, because we learned some things. Kathy led, as you know, the third National Climate Assessment. It was the first time that it was web-based, so you go in, you can click on a key finding, and it'll take you right to the literature, to the graphs. You can click on a graph, it can take you to the data. It's really beautiful the way you can do that. This is something that couldn't be done, say, back in 2000. But beyond that, these are reports that, well, they're supposed to happen every 4 years, but they don't, and they're reports. And so Kathy and Susie and TC have been working on a different way of thinking about assessments to be more useful, more valuable to people who are having to make decisions. So we'll get to that. I'll come back to that. But Susie, so this climate change thing, right, that you've been working on since the very beginning, beyond sort of the physics and chemistry, what is it?
I want to say one thing first before I get to that question, which is, I love the question. you forgot the expert reviews. So in addition to, all the instances that Kathy mentioned, it also goes through a couple of rounds of expert reviews. So any one of you could be contributing to it in the shaping of it from the front end, and later, once we put something on paper, to say, is this actually true? What have we missed? And so on. So, and I think this is actually, I want to pick up from that to get to your question, which is really, it's changed over time that, when you think back also to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that has produced now 5 assessments as well. They have a similarly intense process. It early on started out from just thinking about, what do I understand about changes in the atmosphere and the physical dynamics of the climate system, and more is like, yeah, well, but, what does it mean? What does it mean to anybody? How does it interact with human conditions, with the environments that we already live in? And so over time, over these 4 assessments in the US that we've done, the 5 on the international level that we've done, we've more and more sort of begun to see these interactions, and it gets more complex, it gets more uncertain because you have more variables at play, right? And at the same time, it gets far more relevant to all of you in the room, having to deal with that real world. And what we're seeing now increasingly is that, yeah, there is a big thing coming from climate change, and it's interacting with these, pre-existing conditions, if you will. And those pre-existing conditions mean that we aren't all experiencing climate change in the same way. Some of us have far more capacity to deal with that than others. There's differential social vulnerabilities, economic capabilities to deal with that. We are seeing enormous pickup in the speed with which these impacts are unfolding. So when I look at that, the last day yesterday in particular was super optimistic of how well we can handle all that and how well we can manage and continue to grow, and you better feel okay about the whole thing. Well, I'm not quite as optimistic because we're now beginning to see these interactions with the human conditions, with a policy world that's completely polarized, that's incapable of making fast decisions. So what you're going to see coming at you is something very rapidly, massive changes at far greater speed than anything that you've done so far. That means you have much less decision time to work it out and figure out how you're going to put that levee in place, how you're going to move that road, how you're going to deal with all these people migrating to new places. So if you're thinking this is a smooth ride, I'm sorry to say, but you're going to have a thing coming. And so, those are the human dynamics we now need to deal with, right? That people living in uncertainty, in rapid change, huge complexity, disrupting. And I don't know, do we imagine that the federal government's going to bail all of us out for more and more of Katrinas and Sandys, and I don't know, we can't even name them all anymore, right? Is that really feasible? And I think in that context, we need much more rapid science. We need to have it be useful at the local level. And that's part of the reason why we think we need to shift away from just handing you a 1,000-page report every 4 or 5 years, or however often we can produce them. We need to give you something far more actionable, more frequently, and that's what the sustained assessment is all about.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And so we will be hearing from each of us a little bit more about the sustained assessment. Before we do that, I'm going to ask Lynn. So in addition to being a scholar, you're also a really good storyteller. And we heard John Ross yesterday say, I'm going to paraphrase it, data is critical, but it needs to be tied to a story to be useful. And so how do you use your ability to communicate to empower people to be able to actually use this information through storytelling?
This brings me to something that Kathy said I need to say. She told me last night. I was at LSU for 5 years. I gave climate change presentations in Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and I'm still here to tell about it. So, I think there are 4 things that you need to be really careful about telling when you want to try and tell this story. First of all, the language you choose. it has to be understandable. You need to use words that mean the same thing to who's listening, to the same thing to who's saying it. For example, Jim said, mitigation and adaptation. Well, mitigation to a climate scientist means something very different than to a disaster person. So we have to define what do we mean. Mitigation to a climate scientist means we're reducing the emissions in the air. Adaptation is what you all mean by mitigation. So you have to be really careful about the words that you use. Try to avoid the inflammatory words that you use. I knew in those regions where I was talking about climate change, I couldn't really say, this is a climate change presentation. I never called them that. I always called them planning to protect. And that allowed me then to focus on what are we trying to protect ourselves from. And it also makes it hard for people to deny something that's already happened. So if you start there, planning to protect, define the words, and then the focus. So focus on the outcomes, so the words, language, focus on the outcomes and the issues. If someone has already experienced something, show it to them in data. It gives a bigger perspective. It's not just what they remember or what they perceive. When I used to show people that it's warmed every decade since 1970, it's much more difficult for them to fight you that it's probably going to keep warming when you can see that this is the trajectory, this is what's happening. It's unlikely it's going to change dramatically in a good way. Use appropriate examples. In Louisiana, much as I love the polar bears, that's not the example to use. Use an example. Talk about the fishing places that people like to fish. Are they still there? Can you still catch the kind of fish that you want? Probably not, because the waters are warming, so they're moving north. But if you're interested in hunting or in fishing, use those kinds of examples where you are. When I would talk to the garden club, I talk about the hardiness zones. Why does it matter that the nighttime and winter warming is happening faster in the southeast than the high temperature warming? Why? So what? What do we care? Well, it might matter because it changes the hardiness zones. Where things can grow depends on how cold it gets in the winter. You need to know that. The garden club people, I had people in the audience, oh, that's why this doesn't grow here anymore. Now I get it. Tell them something that matters to them. And then, and then always talk about what you can do about it. What are the possible responses? There are two responses. Mitigation is reducing the emissions, and adaptation is dealing with the impacts, trying to cope with or avoid the impacts. So make sure that you include all of those kinds of things. Don't just tell people terrible information and give them nothing that they can do. No hope, no nothing. You can't do that. It paralyzes people. They can't make decisions when they say, why bother? It's just going to be all terrible anyway. You never, ever do that. Always give hope at the end.
Thank you, Lynn. So, TC, you've been involved in the NCA, heavily involved, leading it along with Kathy. As you mentioned earlier, you're an attorney. You have clients. You deal with decision makers. How can the NCA be useful to people, whether it's to make laws or establish policy? How do you work the NCA in your professional world?
I think, let me back up and tell you that part of increasing resilience and adaptation to me includes governance, creating networks, creating governance structures that supports those networks. I'm general counsel for Cascade Water Alliance. It's a utility made up of 7 municipalities around the Seattle area, and they work together to create a long-term water future. That entity, that kind of governance structure, or the governance or some kind of networking that comes out of this conference, those are resilience steps. That network working together towards backing each other up or facilitating, addressing impacts to climate change. Those are really, those those nerdy sounding process things are as much adaptation and increasing resilience as any physical thing. And so the use of the National Climate Assessment, I've started telling attorneys that I speak with and my colleagues that if you're advising a decision maker, and in our state and in several states you have to do an Environmental Policy Act compliance, or if you have federal funds you have to comply with NEPA. If you're not citing the National Climate Assessment, I think you're vulnerable. It has become such a document that is so accepted and so standard as like starting the baseline of your analysis, that I think you need to know the National Climate Assessment. You need to know what it says about your sector and the area that you're proposing something. So that includes, for me, I represent almost all public entities, and for me that comes into play as they analyze how they're going to move forward on floodplain controls or growth management issues. So the National Climate Assessment can be sort of the initial survey upon which you build through more localized modeling or more localized information.
Thank you, DC. Susie, you have a...
Can I just add something? Yeah, I wanted to just ask before we go further, how many of you had heard about the National Climate Assessment prior to this panel? Woohoo! We did well. How many of you deal in your daily work in any way with, say, a federal agency permitting something, building something, anything, financing something? Okay, so all of you are already linked into decision-making where the National Climate Assessment is used, because federal agencies are required to use the National Climate Assessment in whatever they do. How many of you care about, say, Moody's rating of your community's financial viability? Okay, all of you have been touched by the National Climate Assessment. Moody's analysis of sort of financial liability or financial viability of your local communities has been done using the National Climate Assessment. The Zillow study of how much real estate's going to go underwater by Unit of Concerned Scientists used the National Climate Assessment. So there's just 3 examples, and I could probably tell you 15 more of how you probably have already been touched by it. So this is the kind of ways in which it works itself already in supporting decision making right now. So
thank you, Susie, and this is a perfect segue into the part that we wanted to talk a little bit about. Just describe, and then we'll go to you all to expand this conversation. And that is, so it happens every 4 years. I'll do it the way Susie does it. How many of you would like to see a regularized set of information that's particularly relevant to you and your place and what you do that you don't have to wait every 4 years for? Well, then let's just talk about what we're calling the Sustained National Climate Assessment. It's something that Kathy and Susie and TC have been working a lot about. It's moving the entire process, in my mind, moving it out, not instead of, but in addition to, moving it out of inside the Beltway, where I worked for 20 years, so I get it, it's good, and into our communities all across America with different kinds of local and state governments and businesses and local NGOs, just broadly community. So, Kathy, maybe I'll start with you, since this is something you've dreamed up. Can you describe briefly what we would mean by a sustained assessment? And I'll look to Susie and perhaps TC, and I don't know if you want to add something, but let's just try and do that in just a few minutes, and then we'll go to the group to see if we have anything else they'd like.
Okay, sure. The first thing I want to do, though, is remind Jim that he himself led the development of the report on how to build a sustained assessment.
She told me to.
Anyway, it's a really transformational idea to move away from sort of the past way of doing these assessments, which of course is incredibly important and credible and sets a wonderful scientific foundation, but moving it into a world where people who are engaged in making decisions are actually part of the process and can help define the questions that are answered, actually help produce the data that are going to be used, and that we have a strategic long-term process instead of having a federal emergency every 4 years when we have to get a report done and everybody has to reinvent the whole process. Why don't we acknowledge that the law actually says we need to do this every 4 years, and so we should be keeping on with this process regularly and focusing it strategically on the things that are really needed for decision support. So why can't we reinvent this process? And we did, in fact, make lots of recommendations to the federal government about how precisely that could be done. It turns out, however, that there are limitations to the federal government running things. And one of the limitations is their ability to really engage with decision makers in a real-time way. And so we're now essentially on the brink of moving into a whole new view of how assessments can be done in the context of working with citizens. But the whole idea of a sustained assessment is one where we are being really strategic, really focused, and helping people continually to make better decisions.
I guess so. I'm coming to this from my perspective of working with local, state, federal decision makers, people in NGOs, with professional societies. I'll give you one recent example. So in California, where I was based for the last 10 years, I co-facilitated a process that was mandated by state law, the AB 2800, Assembly Bill 2800, which basically asked state engineers and architects to sit together with scientists and figure out how can we move forward-looking climate science into engineering, design, planning, the whole 9 yards. You might think this is like, aren't we doing this already? Well, actually not. Most things that get built today use data looking in the rearview mirror. We're looking backwards. We're not building for the disasters to come, for the conditions to come. And so this was really designed to, how do we do that? If we want to take it seriously, how do we actually do that? Well, that works a lot by the standards that engineers and architects live by. Any culvert size, any road surface material and whatnot is determined by a whole bunch of standards that guide what is used, how it's done, and so on. And how to change that, given that we're moving into a uncertain future, is a really tough question. And so, for the American Society for Civil Engineers, as an example, they really need to work with what comes out of the NCA and turn it into manuals of practice and into standards that are updated on a regular basis. They actually recently done that, but it's a fairly general document, doesn't work everywhere, and so on and so forth. So how do you do that? That's the kind of work where we need something that links between these every 5 years, every 4 years reports to how these standards get set, how bankers make decisions, that sort of thing, right? That we need something in between. And I think what Kathy and Jim and TC have been working on is really thinking up what kind of partnerships do we need to build that bridge, that human bridge, institutional bridge between that high-level summary and synthesis to what happens on the ground. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very tough to take it into consideration in your day-to-day decision-making.
So thank you, Susie, and that set TC up very nicely to describe. It's not just an idea; it's something that people are working hard to make happen. And TC, I know you've been active in the advisory committee and can you just describe what's up next and what?
Sure. There was a federal advisory committee established after we put out the NCA 3. And that was to work on sustaining the assessment process. That advisory committee was sunsetted or not funded by the current administration. by the current administration. And so it's been, we've been organized as an independent advisory committee, a non-federal advisory committee, and supported by the state of New York, Columbia University, and
American Meteorological Society.
And we're, our report from that independent advisory committee will be out in the next week. So look for it. It's being published, and there'll be some headlines. So please look for it in the next week or so. And I think of it as, Susie used the term bridge. I just think of it as networks of networks. There's already networks around the country who are trying to share what they have done and what works and what doesn't work and the science that they've generated. But we're hoping to support those networks and link them up. I told you I was a connector, and so this just jives with my with how I operate. And I think that in order to support this, we think that an entity will be formed, and it's we've nicknamed it at this point the Science to Action Network, or SCAN. And so you'll kind of look for that lingo as well, and you'll know that that's what we've been working on. And I think that my hope is that it provides the linkages. I talk with people in the Pacific Northwest about some sea level wall or bulkhead adaptation, and I'll know from having talked with people around the country that there's something going on down in over in New Jersey on that, and yet there's no clear way to make sure that those folks know in my little town of Edmonds, Washington, that they're already doing that somewhere else. So we're hoping to support this process of networking people and then helping them assess what works, what doesn't work, what's reliable, what's scientifically based, and so that'll be part of kind of the sustained assessment process, and I believe the federal government will be part of that eventually.
Thank you, TC. So this is perfect. Now we're, and thank you, Duke, for adding a little bit of time to that clock back there, because we started a little late. But this is actually a perfect time just to let you know that beyond this panel, we want everyone involved, right, TC, right, Kathy, Susie? Everyone involved in the sustained assessment. You can be involved even if you live inside the Beltway, but particularly if you live outside of the Washington, D.C. Beltway, be involved if you care about these issues. It makes it better, stronger. So with that, yes, to questions. Actually, we'll have one in the back, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Dan Ackerman with American Public Media. Thanks for your really insightful comments today and for all your great work on the NCAs. I'm curious how you perceive media coverage of these NCAs. Do you feel that the media has generally done a decent job of conveying your key messages in terms of tone and accuracy, and where do you see room for improvement on that front? Yeah,
this is for Susie.
Well, we worked really, really hard to try to actually get messages and good graphics and good stories out to you to then replicate. We've also tracked, and we've had 10,000s of hits from the assessment. So it's pretty amazing. I think what's interesting is to sort of look at the coverage of NCA 3 and 4 in comparison. So, so the third assessment came out during the Obama administration, and you had a supportive president at that point to get it out, and we really did a lot of work. We got a great coverage. NCA 4, it was attempted to basically be released on Black Friday, and the story, we were told, is not about somebody trying to hide it, and it was the perfect way to make sure that there was a lot of media coverage. So it was, it was great, right? That was the story. So someone is trying to hide the truth from us, and it really helped, I would say, and the coverage was even better. In terms of the quality of coverage, I think it's become and I would say this is really part of a much larger story of how media coverage of climate change has changed over time. It's become much better over time. So I think that's what I would say as a summary. There's a lot more detail we could go into, but yes, thank you for doing that, and keep doing it, please.
Thank you for this panel. Now I have a better understanding of NCA. My question is, how does it relate to IPCC in terms of context? And then also the Drawdown project by Paul Hawken. I use Drawdown very heavily because it's very practical. I can apply it on a daily basis. So how does the NCA relate to those two entities?
Yeah. Did you want to talk about drawdown? Because I can. Okay. Yes. So IPCC and NCA. The NCA really is the national version of the IPCC. Timing tends to be off, but both of them are dedicated to updating the state of knowledge based on the updated science, the updated research, and understanding of impacts. And so that's the short term. There are other differences, but so it's not like one is the subsidiary of another. These are independent. There are other countries that are doing national assessments as well. I love Drawdown. And I recently had a chance to talk to Paul Hawken about it. He's, I think, going to maybe do a second version of it. For those of you who don't know, check out Drawdown. Just Google it. And Paul Hawken, he and his group give 100 examples of how we can make sure that we're reducing the greenhouse gases the way, and they're really practical and interesting ones. Like, I think the fifth most significant one is educating girls around the world. It's just such a really cool one. How it connects to NCA, I bet.
Yes, it's used.
Yeah, I bet he used
in
it.
the analysis.
In particular, the mitigation chapter.
So I can add a couple of things to what Jim just said. So there is a manual interaction too, which is that many of us who work on the NCA also at the same time are co-authors on the IPCC. So, the knowledge walks, obviously an experience walks between those two processes. Also means we're more tired than those who don't work on both at the same time. But there is, obviously the literature is global. We don't fully consider all of those issues in the U.S. assessment, but there are differences in the approval process, in the political process, which are important to, we can go into more details. And I do happen to know that Paul and his many analysts used NCA3 as part of their assessments.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank you, Susie, for kind of bringing to our attention that that the federal government agencies are using this in their NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act processes. In Mobile, Alabama, I'm Mobile Baykeeper, we just dealt with the deepening and the widening of the ship channel, and the Corps returned a finding of no significant impact which we thought was crazy, but they're saying this project will have no impact because of how much climate change will impact us. And yet the community never got that memo. It's still a problem. But the community never really understood that. It took us a long time to really understand that climate impacts, sea level rise in particular, is really being heavily weighed. But I want to touch back to what Lynn brought up in the communication piece. So how do we get, as a community, our state and federal agencies to actually state agencies to use it, Alabama. And then secondarily, though, getting the federal agencies to admit that they're using it in a way that helps the public better understand, especially in the Gulf Coast, that climate change might be real.
I'm a little bit speechless, only because I don't know how you make a government do anything. What I can tell you is how you can help a government do something. When I was in Louisiana, they were doing their most recent hazard plan, and I was fortunately invited to speak to them, so I got climate change. I took their hazard plan. I included climate change line by line into the places where it belonged. So it was included now in their hazard plan in not an easy way to just cut out when the next people came. And it was because we didn't use, again, the words, but we used, the information and the issues. And the same thing actually happened in Biloxi, Mississippi. They included sea level rise in their hazard plan because I had been working with them. And I know that many communities, if you can help people to see where they already have authorities, where if they just change the lens a little bit, they can use that climate information and it fits right in. And they have authorities to make choices and decisions that they didn't really think about because they had never looked at them through a climate lens. So if you can help communities to think about the issues in a way that they can accept, but then also see them through the lens of authorities that they already have, then things begin to change. And I know that because I've helped a couple of them in the South, and I'm still here to tell about it. So, yeah.
Representing local government, I do think that government officials are well-intended. And they may have forgot to use it. But I think you can remind them of that in an effective way by taking the relevant portions and submitting it as official comments on the project. Hopefully you can avoid litigation, but saying that they ignored analysis that really is relevant to the impacts of a project is you're doing them a favor. I mean, you have to think of it as you're doing them and the public a favor by making that comment prior to them making a decision that would be vulnerable to attack.
Can I add to that? To simply say that, as much as you can't walk into maybe an office and say, here's a climate change issue, because it just has like all kinds of really sticky things attached to it. In the same way, you can't often walk into a room and say, here's a federal report that really matters, right? It just doesn't work that way. And so part of the beauty of the sustained assessment and this notion of networks is that we actually work with the people who are already trusted in the places that need to make those decisions, as opposed to some outsider coming in and saying, here's a big fat report that you need to take into consideration. Because the information travels on trust. It walks with us into the room. I've just, for 10 years, built my relationships in California. I'm working, given, yes, it's a much more open, liberal sort of government situation, but still it's a matter of local folks needing to make decisions, and it's based on, do they trust me? Do we have a relationship? And so it's building on that social capital that will help move this into the places where it needs to go.
So unfortunately, thank you. Unfortunately, I was just looking at that clock over there. We have 17 seconds left. So sorry, we really intended to have a lot more time for conversation, but I guess that's the way it goes. I would encourage anyone that has any more questions or would like to be involved or just talk to these amazing ladies. Find a time to do that. So Duke, one last thing, and I think I'm on negative time here. But I learned Duke's not listening. Okay, it doesn't matter. You all are. So so yesterday, I learned something I'd never known. I didn't know there was such a thing as river keepers, and Georgia Ackerman talked about that. Let's think about 10x keepers going forward. Anyway, that was it. We're in negative time. Thank you very much for this. Thank you to the panel.